Ame taki api. Se haetik de iokpea dedwa kawita on yakapi he wopera hecha. He chantewa stena pe choose apido. E misha Jeremy Redigal maki api e se situa peto on yake he hechi togwahi. Tka Montana dechi he ichachmab, he shahina o yanke head ichachmab. Unkana e chi taha he wakpe kutega wakpeto o yate taha ga kunshi e chi taha he Nakota Pabaksa Dakota taha he Fort Belknap ga Fort Peck, Montana. Misha washichuya e chena he chiri chachmab. Homakshina he han e Dakota o maspe wachi. Naka hekta wania tu napchiwankas eche sisitu hechi hedwa waki. Echi he Dakota o maspe wachi. Naka sisitu akpetu o maonspe wakantia ed o ape. Ampetu I yo hea he kunshiga onkana he na o woa hadake. E Dakota ya unspe makiab. He hechir unspe mi chichie. He kam hena he o woa hadake. Wana dehan he techab hena unspe wich hawakie. Sisito hechi he dehan he chona napi. He Dakota yu pia wohadakab he chona napi. He wikchemna nooms eche. He techab hena wana he wikchemna noom he yu pia wohadakab. He ate yokpi mai. So my relatives, my name is Jeremy Redigal. I come from the Sisseton Wapton Oyate in Sisseton, South Dakota, northeast corner, borders Minnesota. But I grew up here in Montana. I grew up off and on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, also down in Helena. My mother lives in Helena. My father lives on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. We're not Cheyenne. He moved down there after I was born, and he still remains there. But on my grandmother's side, we descend from the Dakota people of Fort Peck and the Nakota or Assiniboine people of Fort Belknap. And so growing up my whole life was kind of all over Montana. I have ties and connections to this place to acknowledge our Blackfeet relatives who, to my understanding, this was their historical territory, even though today we have multiple tribes that live in the area. And the Blackfeet people are special to me because I had an adopted mom who helped raise me, who was from off of St. Mary Lake. She lived there, or grew up there, and then she eventually had moved to Helena. And we recently just lost her back in June. But she was a huge inspiration in my upbringing as far as embracing my language and culture. And so as I was speaking Dakota, I talked about how when I was younger, I did not know my language, which is a common story for so many Native people today. And growing up, we would hear words, we would hear little things that we would learn as far as our language goes, but as far as fluent speech, it's something that we're just not taught anymore. And there are a few families and a few communities where the language is still spoken, but those are rare. It's not a common thing anymore. But ever since I was young, for some reason, I wanted to learn my language. It was always a dream of mine. And one thing is we come from different bands, different dialects, so that's another thing that gets thrown into it. So it took me years to get to a point of knowing the right path to take for what I wanted to do as far as learning my language. So tonight I'm going to talk about my journey as far as learning my language, but also the importance of language in general, not just native languages, but languages throughout the world and the diversity that exists with languages. And one thing I was told a long time ago was like, if you speak 3 languages or more, you're multilingual. If you speak 2 languages, you're bilingual. And if you speak 1 language, you're American. And so there's a lot of truth to that. When people travel throughout the world, they see that there are people that speak multiple languages. It's common. A few years ago, I was asked over in Grand Forks, North Dakota, they have a English as second language school over there, ESL. And so they asked me to come and present to their high school class on Dakota language. And so I did that. And it was really eye-opening. Half the students, for some reason, were just regular American kids that didn't speak two languages, but for whatever reason, they went to that school. And then the other half of the student population were from Mexico or from Somalia, different countries, and they spoke English as a second language. And so I asked the classroom how many spoke two languages or more. So half of the students, raised their hand. And then I asked how many spoke three languages, and a few more still raised their hand. And I said, how many speak more than three? And there was a young girl in there that spoke 5 languages. And so after I did my presentation talking about our language, talking about the worldview, from within our language, the interesting thing was that the American kids, not a single one of them asked me a question. But all of the ones that came from other places and spoke multiple languages, they had all kinds of questions for me. And they would compare the things that I said from my culture to their culture. So I thought that was really, really interesting. So we're in a day and age today, they actually, I believe it's through the UN or something, but they declare this decade as, for native languages. And so there's a lot of work being done throughout Indian country, a lot of young people that are learning to speak their language. Last night I was driving by on, I think it's on Central down there, and there's a sign by the Salvation Army, and it had something in Ojibwe for the little shell. I thought that was really cool, because we need to start to see those things, and we need to start to hear our language, and we need to not be afraid to speak our language. And we need to not be afraid when we hear other languages spoken to embrace that and to learn how to use those, learn those words, whether it's Spanish or native languages or whatever languages it are, we need to embrace those things. So for myself, when I moved back to my reservation 9 years ago, I was running a youth program in Helena at the Indian Center there, and one of the things that I did was really encourage young people to learn their language. And of course we had native students or youth from multiple different tribes. We had one Cree speaker who would put on a community class. We had a Lakota speaker, actually lived here in Great Falls, but he would travel down and he would put on classes. And then I would, for the other students, I would try to find them materials or speakers back in their home communities or their reservations to be able to learn from, and just encourage them, even if it was just words or how to introduce yourself, whatever it was, to learn. So, but then, I had this dream since I was a kid that I wanted to learn my language, and I ended up getting laid off from my job. They ran out of funding, and my wife and I, we made the decision to move back to my home reservation in Siston, and with the sole intention of learning to speak my language. And we took a risk. We had no job or no housing, and we loaded up our vehicle with our teepee, and we went out there, and we lived in it for 2 months. And had no clue what I was gonna do or how I was gonna do it, but I knew that we had about 60 fluent speakers. Our reservation, our tribe, we have about 15,000 tribal members now, and we had about 60 fluent speakers out of that 15,000. Now we have multiple dialects, right? So we have other reservations that are related to us that also have speakers, but ours, for the Dakota, we probably have the most. So that was the decision we made. I went to the college and signed up, and because they had just started a language learning program there, and that was the start of my journey. I walked into a room, they had a group of elder men that were in there, and it was really cool because one of the first old men that I met was my grandpa's cousin. And so he was a relative of mine, and so I got to learn from him. And then I also signed up for the regular, that was just like a side thing where they were there and you had the access to visit with them. But then they had the regular classes that was taught by one of the elder women in the community. So I was the only one, back then I was really the only person in that program. And later it would grow. It's a huge program now, but back then it was very new and there was not very many people learning the language. And so I was the only one to complete that entire 2.5-year program, learning from a first language speaker. After that, it became second language speakers that started to teach the courses. And so through that experience, I would spend every day with her, Monday through Friday, taking classes. Once I got into like the more advanced classes, I was pretty much the only student in the class. Language 1 was mandatory. All students had to take language 1 to at least familiarize themselves with the language and culture. And then the elder men, I would sit with them once a week and learn from them. Back then it was very difficult because we didn't know how to go about learning the language. I didn't know what to do. I had no experience and I had no guidance. So we were just kind of winging it. We were just going with it. And sometimes they would just teach me words, and sometimes they would speak in full conversation and I have no clue what they're saying. So I would record them. And I just knew that this was important for me. And I had to sacrifice a lot. I never, hardly ever left, never came back to Montana for a long time because I knew that our time was crucial. And so I spent every moment that I could with these fluent speakers. And not just the language, but the culture, because you can't have one without the other, they would tell me. So I spent 2.5 years. I graduated with my teaching certificate for the language. Still was not fluent, still was not even barely conversational, but I was starting to get a grasp and starting to understand the language. And then we started to get more people interested, more people were joining the program. We ended up applying to get funding from Shakopee Reservation. They have their big casino, so they have lots of money. And we did a collaboration with all the other Dakota communities, Fort Peck, Spirit Lake, and Nebraska Indian Community College. And so they funded what they called the Voices of Our Ancestors grant, and it was for 2 years. And they gave each college $1 million budget to create a program and to hire fluent speakers and to hire 4 learners that would get paid full time to learn the language. And so I was involved with that, but the first go round I passed it up because I wanted 4 other people to get involved, and I was just going to volunteer my time to be a part of it. And after we actually went and proposed to our council to match that funding. So then we could double the program and we could hire 8 people. In the end, we ended up hiring 10 to learn the language, to get paid full time, and then a bunch of have our fluent speakers coming in, and then a couple other second language that were really advanced to help teach it. And I was accepted to be in the apprentice program, so the rest of them were ones that were going through the teaching certificate program, and then those of us that already had our teaching certificate, we were a part of an apprentice program, so our goal was strictly just perfecting our speech and working with those fluent speakers day in and day out. And so I ended up being at the college for 6.5 years and doing that work with them. And then I was burnt out and I was going to be done. I was at the end of my 2 years with the apprentice program, and I was just going to take some time off. But we had a tribal language program that was separate from the college, and the lady there had been there for 20 some years, and she just up and retired. And we had fear because of tribal politics. We didn't know what was going to happen to the program and all of the valuable resources and materials that had been produced over the years. So nobody applied for that job, so I had to go in and apply for it. And so I stayed there for 1.5 years and made sure that we could get somebody in there to run it. And then after that, I spent 1 year, because of COVID, doing online teaching. Ended up down in New Mexico going to school at the Institute of American Indian Arts, so I still stayed involved by teaching online. So through the 9 years that I've been learning, I've had a lot of, I have reflection now on how things went in the situations that we're in our communities, and the urgency of what it takes to be able to breathe life back into our languages. Because we've learned that we don't say our languages are dying. because we believe that there's a spirit attached to our language, because we believe these languages were given to us from the Creator. And so if those things, one of our elders said, hey, daku akanki ha he daku nari koyake he t'eo kihishni, you know, if you have, something has a spirit attached to it, it can't die. So it can go dormant or it can go away from us, but it's still there. And so we believe that it's just a matter of us breathing life back into it and making it a part of our everyday life again. So through those years, I worked with many elders. I think on average about 15 that I worked with regularly, or quite a bit, and then probably that number of ones that I've at least had some kind of contact with and sat and visited with. Through that, there's been really like almost, I guess you could say like spiritual or, things that were really kind of crazy how they ended up turning out. But we had, a lot of experiences. When it comes to working with our elders and our fluent speakers, our elders, I have a mentor from Northern Cheyenne. He told me this one time. He said, our elders are the closest to historical trauma and our children are the closest to extinction. And our elders were the ones that went through boarding schools. And I hope everybody is aware of, what boarding schools were and what they did. And so I don't need to get into all of that, but it was definitely very impactful in a negative way of what it did to our communities. So our elders come from that, and they came from a generation where they were looked down upon, even sometimes by our own people, the ones that spoke their language. Because of everything that happened, we had to go towards the Washichu way, we had to go towards the white way, the American way, we had to learn to speak English, we had to have jobs and do all of these things to survive. And so a lot of a few of our people that held on to those things were looked down upon. So we come to today where now all of a sudden everybody's going to them and wanting all these answers and all this wisdom and all of these things, and sometimes they don't know how to respond to that. Sometimes some of them don't speak their language anymore. They haven't spoken since they were young. Or they would only feel comfortable speaking it to other fluent speakers. So the dynamics of that in itself was a challenge. Is like, how do we go about doing this? How do we bring them in and make them feel like they're valued and that they're needed, and listening and hearing and understanding the traumas that they carry? So that by itself was a huge challenge, and something that we still have not mastered, but we've definitely gotten better at. And unfortunately, so back then there were 60 fluent speakers on our reservation, and today we have about 20. So just in the last 9 years, we've lost a third of them. And I think back prior to that, when they first started, our tribe issued a state of emergency with the language, and at that point I think there was 100 fluent speakers left. So most of our speakers today are in their 80s. There's just a couple that are younger than that. So, it's just going to be a matter of time before our speakers are gone, our first language speakers. But the good news is we have about 20 young people that can speak fluently, or at least conversationally, with the elders. And then the efforts to start immersion schools. We have a few established, but those take a long time to get them up and running and to work out all the kinks and to find the right ways to do it. So there's hope. There's hope that our young people are going to be able to carry on our language. It's going to change. There's no way around it. Language changes. It always has, and it's always going to. I think English even, right, is, the older generation sometimes maybe struggles with how the younger ones talk, so I think that's relevant no matter where you're at. But it's been a long journey, and so I'm gonna, I'll probably, share a few stories about some of the elders, because that's, what my whole life has been for the last 9 years, is dedicated to my relationships with them. And it changes your way of being, it changes your way of thinking, and it changes your just how you carry yourself as a human being when I no longer would hang out with people my own age. I would just hang out with these old people all the time. And one day we had put on we had a little log cabin on campus that was dedicated to our language and our culture, so that's where all the cultural things would take place. And we put on a bingo we were gonna do it all in Dakota. And it was a kind of a giving thanks to our fluent speakers. So we put that on, we had a good turnout, all kinds of people showed up, and that night somebody that we didn't know, this young lady had brought her mom, who was very elderly and in a wheelchair, and they wheeled her in. Nobody knew who she was, and she was blind. She had both of her legs amputated, and she was missing most of her fingers. And so we went and talked to her, come to find out she's a fluent speaker. So we, wanted to know more about her, and she had left the res when she was 9 years old, and she went to live in California with her older brother, and she stayed out there. And she was, so I think over 60 years she had lived in California, and she was probably one of the best speakers that I had ever had the privilege of working with. And she was the longest living dialysis patient in the United States. She'd been on dialysis for almost 20 years. And so she came home for the last year of her life. And she was more than thrilled to work with us. And so we would drive up to her home. She lived in Fargo, so we would drive up to her house once a week and visit with her and record her. And she was so animated in her storytelling, probably because she was blind. I don't know, but she was very animated in her storytelling. And so we had the privilege to sit there and work with her and take in all of this knowledge and these stories that she had been raised by her parents and grandparents with, that she had remembered. And one day I asked her, I said, how is it that you still, because we had people that still lived on the reservation and grew up speaking the language and had a hard time talking because they just didn't talk it anymore. I said, how did you retain the language all that time while you were out in California since you were 9 years old? And she said, I love my language. And her sisters could not fluently speak. They were younger than her. They could not fluently speak, but they could fluently comprehend. So she would call them on the phone all the time and just talk Indian to them, and they would understand what she was saying, and they would just respond to her in English. So that's how she retained her language all those years. And so she made the decision to go off dialysis, and so her days were limited, and we went up to see her, and she gathered us all around, all of us that were learning, and we sat there and listened to her for an hour, talk to us in the language, encouraging us, and sharing what she needed to share with us. Those kinds of things were to me, were more on a spiritual level, like something was in place to have us be in those times, in those places at those times. I had another, my main mentor was the one that I said was my grandpa's cousin. He comes from the Hopkins family, and he was raised by his grandma, who had shared with him all these stories and all of these things when he was younger. And so because I was related to him, we became really close. And I worked with him for 4 years, and one day we were in Standing Rock at a language conference, and we got word that he had had a heart attack. He didn't pass away, but he had a heart attack. So we went back home, we went to the hospital, and we seen him. We walked into the hospital room, and he has all these tubes and everything, and we just broke down crying, because here's this man that is like our mentor and our, the one teaching us everything. They ended up releasing him from the hospital, and I went out to his house to see him, and he just kind of laughed, and he's like, I didn't know that I meant that much to you guys until I see you guys start crying. But one thing that he did for me was the first year that I learned from him, all he did was talk about our values, because in our culture we have certain values that we are supposed to live by. Wo hoda, which is respect, wa onshida, which is compassion, waditake, bravery, all of these different values that were supposed to be the foundation of who we are as Dakota people, and he would talk about those to me all the time. And he would just bring it up, and he would give examples of what it means to carry yourself with respect and all of these things. And then he kind of quit talking about that stuff after that first year, and we just went on doing other things. And when he was released from the hospital, the doctors told him, your time's limited, your heart is not good. And when I went out to visit him, the last conversation I had with him, he went back to those values. He went back to the beginning of where he started to teach me from. And then he passed away, you know. So for me, I felt very fortunate that those were the things that, you know, were my foundation in learning my language and understanding that it was more than just the words that come out of your mouth, that it's a way of life and a cultural perspective. He would say, Dakota Wiyukchan is a Dakota way of thinking. And then he would say, Washichu Wiyukchan is a white way of thinking. He say, not that it's wrong, not that it's worse, it's different. In Dakota, in our families, we refer to our mother's sisters as our mother. Our father's brothers are our father. So our father's brothers' kids are our siblings. They're our brothers and sisters. And our mother's sisters' kids are our siblings. So that is a Dakota perspective that is relevant to the language and to the culture. And all of our elders, all of the ones of that generation is our kunshi and our onkana. They're our grandmas and our grandpas, even if they're not blood related to you. And that's how you address them, that's how you talk to them. We don't talk to our mother-in-law out of respect. The women don't talk to their father-in-law out of respect. So these are things that are relevant to our culture, but the language holds the key to a lot of those things. So those were the things that he was able to teach me. Right when, in the height of COVID was when I took over the tribal language program, and it was probably the most stressful thing I ever had to do, because here I'm brand new as a director of this program, working with these elders, knowing that we have this crucial time to work with them, and then we're hit with a pandemic, and we're losing people left and right. We're losing elders. And then these elders were adamant that we keep working. That was really scary and really stressful and really hard. And I had another elder gentleman who was 85 at the time, and he was had more energy than these kids. He just wouldn't quit, and he would show up to my office every single day and sit there drinking coffee and just challenging me with my way of thinking, sharing things with me, sharing oral history that goes back thousands of years, and never saying it in English, only telling me in Dakota. So I'd have to figure it out. I'd have to understand what he's talking about. He called me up, and I was I had an appointment. COVID's still going on. Things are shut down. You had to, so I was like, I have this appointment. I got to be there. And he's like, well, I have something to share with you, and I'll be there in a minute, and it'll just be real quick. So I'm outside, and I'm just waiting and waiting, and he's just taking forever. And I was like, I got to go. And I'm getting ready to leave, and he pulls into the parking lot. And so I'm like, okay, so I know how I'm supposed to be around my elders. So we go and we sit down on the bench, and he's showing me this stuff that he wants to share with me. But I can't hide the fact that I'm in a rush and I need to get going. And in our Dakota way, they would never cuss you out, in a traditional way. They probably do a lot of them nowadays, but they would reprimand you by telling you a story. And he told me a story, and it made me feel about that tall when I was done. And more or less, he was just saying, my days are numbered. You need to make time. So from that point on, I told my employees, nothing in the morning, because every morning he comes by. So I had to schedule all of my stuff in the afternoon. And sure enough, within a couple of months, he was in hospice and ended up leaving us, And then my kunshi, who I took as my kunshi, she took me as her takloja. She was the main instructor in the classes, so I spent 2.5 years with. And then after she left the college, about the time that I completed the program, I still continue to have a relationship with her, would go out to her house, and we would have sweat and do different things, and we got to be really close, and she would share a lot with me. And so what they say a long time ago, in our language we have male speech and we have female speech, and those are different. Obviously they can understand each other, and the language is the same, but they use different relative terms, different endings. Women are more pronounced in their speech, more formal. Men shorten their words and talk fast. So they said a long time ago that when a young boy is born, he was raised by his grandma and his mother and his aunties for the first 5 years of his life, so that this foundation was laid with him to be, to have compassion and have all these things that the mother and the women of the family nurturing. So that would be the foundation of them. And then they go on to be raised by the grandpa and the dad and the uncles and learn the men stuff, And so then their speech is going to change, because then they're going to start to mimic the men in the family. And so for me, I was really fortunate, because I felt like even though I was in my 30s, here I was being raised by a grandma as far as my language learning went. And so my foundation was her speech and the way that she talked and the things that she shared with me. So after about 4 years of working with her, she ended up having a stroke. And she was okay. She was put into a nursing home for a while, and she could still talk, communicate. I'd go see her all the time. She'd continue to share things with me. I was in Rapid City one day, and I got a phone call from her, but I missed the phone call. So I still have the voicemail to this day, and she was just so excited, talking to me all in Dakota in the message, just all in Dakota, and telling me how I need to call her, and we're going to go do this and that and all this stuff. And she ended up having another stroke right after that. And this time it was bad. She couldn't talk. So she was put in a nursing home, and she lived for like 2 years longer, but not able to communicate or anything. And so it was very difficult. And just over a year ago, she had finally passed away. And by the time I went down to New Mexico, I had been working with these elders for 8 years, and it was it burned me out. It burned me out, and I didn't know if I had any more left in me, honestly, because it was just, I buried them all. I think there's 2 left today that I still that are still alive, of the ones that I've worked with. So a lot of heartache and a lot of happiness, a lot of different emotions that go into it. Seen other ones. I had another one that I worked with the longest. He was there from day one, and he passed away about a year ago. He was ornery. He was so mean for the first 4 years. I wanted nothing to do with him. It wasn't helpful. I would dodge him if I could. And then when Orson, my main mentor, when he passed away, he was everybody looked at him as the main one. He was the go-to for the language. When he passed away, all of a sudden, Delbert, the ornery one, he started to really get involved, and he started to come around more. And I think that, and we've noticed now that there's like a pattern with it, that as they pass away, the other ones, maybe the younger one, they step up, and they start to see the severity of it. And the interesting thing about Uncle Delbert was that he was from Pine Ridge on his dad's side and from Siston on his mother's side, and they're 2 completely different dialects. So he spoke a mixture of those dialects. And then I started to understand why he was so ornery, because he felt shunned, or he felt less than because of that, because of how he spoke. And once we embraced how he spoke and we just rolled with it, and we didn't care that he would mix Lakota words with Dakota words, and our relationship grew, and he ended up becoming one of my best friends. So with that, I tell young people that if you learn your language, it's going to help heal you, it's going to help you feel connected, it's going to help you know who you are and where you come from. But in turn, we're actually helping our elders, the ones that are closest to that historical trauma, we're helping them heal. We're helping them to fulfill something in their life, because they have the ability to share and pass these things on and know that they're valued and cared for. So those are the things that I want to encourage people with, regardless of where you come from. I know in Great Falls there's a lot of Little Shell people, maybe Rocky Boy, Blackfeet. There are still fluent speakers out there. There are still people that hold knowledge. There are still people that carry these cultural ways. So we need to go out and we need to seek it and we need to find it, and we need to embrace those things, and we need to start to rebuild ourselves as far as our identity goes and who we are. Growing up, I'm mixed. My mom is non-native, my dad is native, and it was a struggle that I had my whole life. Even though I always identified as on the native side, I still had difficulties because of how I looked growing up. And now, if people say things to me, I say, you know, I may look a certain way, but I can speak my language and I know who I am and where I come from. You know, so even on those that are not native or those that come from other communities or from different countries or different places, you know, language is important. Language is very important, and as we go into the second part where we're going to go over into the paintings and talk about a lot of that, is that the storytelling and the communication is what it all comes down to. And we live in a day and age, social media, all of these things where we're starting to be disconnected from being human in reality. Like, that is where we're at. And so we have to learn to get back to what it is to be able to connect with people, what it is to be able to communicate with people. And our young relatives here, when they walked in and they seen the video up there of Charlie Russell using Indian Sign Language, and she just stopped dead in her tracks and she looked right at it, and you could just see her light up because she was seeing something that was somewhat familiar to her, you know? And so we're going to talk about that when we go out there. We'll talk about plain sign language. We'll talk about how intelligent our people were that lived on this continent, that they could speak multiple languages and they would know how to have sign language, and that American Sign Language today is influenced by Native Sign Language. You know, something that people don't know, something that people don't talk about, because plain sign language is going away. It's hardly known about. Our storytelling, our oral histories, how strong they were. Our oral histories were very accurate until the disruption happened to them. But we have very strong oral histories that are still alive today, and things that you won't find in books. And our elders, my uncle, he would tell me how he goes, his uncle lived on the reservation and never left. He never went nowhere, but yet he knew about things that existed in far off places because of that oral history that was handed down. You know, so it's validating us as Native people that our people were extremely intelligent, and they had a serious connection to the land and to the stars and the solar system, and they knew about those things, and our people still do, you know. Watch that.